As the Me Too movement has gathered steam this year, the music business is facing some tough choices about how it navigates this issue. We're here today with 4 business leaders to talk about how they're making decisions in this new climate. I'd like to welcome Tristan Cooper Smith, Ericka Coulter, Milana Lewis, and Edith Bo. And this is a conversation on leading business through the Me Too era. So ladies, let's start with this question. If an executive's been accused of misconduct, how do you decide whether to do business with that person?
Well, I myself, someone had reached out to me and I had advised my client to kind of sway the other direction, just because I don't want to put my client in an uncomfortable situation and something potentially dangerous. And, you know, if they're uncomfortable in any capacity, then that's on me. That's my client. So I have to look out for my client's best interest. So that's where I stand.
I think this is the hardest question to answer, because in a services-oriented business, you're dealing with people day to day, and you're having a much more, in-person relationship with them. But as a platform, which is what STEM is, it becomes really hard to decide because you don't necessarily know who's using the service all the time and their background. And that's been a challenge of ours when there's some people that may be using the service that are associated with misconduct that we have no control over. But then if someone that we know has come to us and wanted to use the platform or signed up, how can we turn them away? And what do we do? And it's really hard to draw the line. And it's hard to really figure it out.
I think that's the crux of the problem right now, is not having very, very clear boundaries on what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. It is not appropriate to be a 27-year-old taking your producers out to strip clubs until dawn and expensing it. Now, that was my experience, and I can see that that's not appropriate now, so many years later. But really getting crystal clear, as an industry collectively on what's right and wrong, because it's so blurry. It's an industry, I think, that is unlike so many others, where so many of the practices and the client relationships fall into this gray area. So it isn't clear. So if we can clear that up, then there's a more defined understanding of what's right and what's wrong, and then I know that I'm crossing the line or not.
And I think, do we have to have some kind of understanding of, where accusations turn into due process, or, an understanding of how these accusations are, the executives are penalized in the workplace already, or are you forced to make decisions as business leaders yourself where you have to take Me Too claims into consideration?
That's true too. Yeah, you do. You have to take them both into consideration and do your research. I mean, I speak to a lot of friends. I ask for their opinions, and I just kind of try to inform my clients. As a manager, as an E&R, I'm putting, creatives directly in sessions. So I want to make sure that whoever they're going to be in a session with, they're in a safe space. And whether I have to come and I have to be with them for a little bit, make sure they're comfortable, that's me as a manager. I have to make sure that I'm there and I'm applying my due diligence.
Right. I agree with you 100%. I think it's also about taking ownership of the position, that the roles that we have. Like, we're in these roles for a reason, and I think it's making sure that we express that people can come to us to talk, can feel comfortable. Just create an environment that you can just be creative. That's what the music industry is about. So, let's focus on the music and make it towards where that that's the focus when you come in and leave.
And not safety.
Yeah, 1,000%.
And do you think things have changed? Do you think these conversations that we're having have changed the experience your clients or you're having in the workplace?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like, if anything, people are not only more expressive, but also, in a good way, that you get to know a person that you're working with, and get to know the people that you're signing or, you're engaging with. Sometimes you can work with somebody over 20 years and not know much about them. I think now is more like, hey, we can be friends and we can hang out and I can be vulnerable around you and be comfortable and know that I'm in a safe place, man or woman.
Mm-hmm. And your experience, you're working in a major label. Have you experienced any changes in the workplace there?
It's a family. I think if anything, it just makes everyone come closer to that you do feel like if there was ever an issue, we can talk about it. No one has to feel embarrassed or no one has to feel like they're not a part of it. I think that, my team 1,000% is good at making sure we feel like we can all talk to each other and we're in this together.
How do you set expectations with new hires on what the culture and what the value system looks like and what to do if you witness something that is maybe not aligning with what the expectations are meant to be set up to be?
I think it's going into everything with new energy and making sure that they understand, you know, this is a place that I want you to be creative. I want you to feel safe. But at the same time, it's about representing the brand. You know, I'm not with my team, and it's a very, very small team, and so I'm not with them everywhere that we go, but I know that I feel comfortable knowing that they're representing the basement in a way that, you know, that's my team meter. I know that they have it. And then also, you know, just making sure that people understand what leadership looks like. I've been blessed to, you know, just be around just from the start, from my Interscope days to, you know, now being at Epic, and then also now being able to start the basement, just surrounding myself by incredible mentors that, you know, they just taught really good leadership, you know, men and women. And so I was shielded from certain things from the Me Too movement, but I also, you know, were aware of things to know how to move accordingly, and also, you know, be a voice for people, and also be that shoulder that certain people can come talk to.
When I published my open letter, the minute after I published it, I reached out to 4 really incredible men in the music industry who had been mentors to me to acknowledge them for how honorable they were, and to shine a light on those ones too, you know, because I think it's really important that the conversation also includes that it's not most men that are behaving badly. You know, it's just a few, because we don't want to deter boys and men from wanting to get into this industry because they're afraid, because there's some wonderful leaders, and those men have such an opportunity to make an impact. Like, they should be at this round table too.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's so true.
Reinforcing behavior through praise.
Yeah, and through
it's
modeling.
really powerful, and that's something that we can all do at our own companies, is just point out when the right behavior is happening and honor it, because then people will hopefully replicate it.
And bring the men in to educate as well.
Milana, how do you handle it in your business?
So it's been really interesting for me, because this is my first time working in technology, and we're working in technology at the intersection of entertainment. And I didn't realize how desensitized I was to certain behavior until I started working with people who did not come from entertainment. And so things as little as mansplaining, like, I couldn't even detect it in conversations. And it took the men actually that I was working with to point it out in other men. And so what I got really lucky with is some of the people that we hired on earlier in our company helped set the expectations of what behavior could look like from other men, because they were more sensitive to it than me, which was really surprising. And it took me back, and I had to put a lot of work in to really think about, well, what is my value system? And as a female executive, how do I exhibit that in a way that sets an expectation that empowers and also inspires other women, but also sets an expectation with men? And I can't say I've gotten it right every time, and I know we've made a lot of mistakes. And what we're doing now to really serve us moving forward is reevaluating our values. And a lot of tech companies, is sort of a best practice. When you start a company, you write your value statement, you write the 5 things that really matter to you, and it's sort of like the framework that you not only hire people for, like when you're looking at candidates, you're like, do they fit our culture, right? Well, that means looking at the values. When you performance review people who are working at the company, you're meant to, and we didn't do this early on, and now we're seeing the repercussions of it, but moving forward, we're making a really big effort to bring the values into the performance reviews. So it's not just about how much money did you bring in or how much code did you deliver, it's did you live the things that we said that this company really values. And in decision-making, what has actually hurt us is back then, and when I say back then, I mean like before we were reevaluating our new values, we didn't live all the values equally, so they jeopardized each other. And so moving into this new process, we're really thinking about how do we say things in a way that, one, feel authentic, but also can't be, like someone can't point to something and say, well, we don't really do this, so then why is this important?
I love that concept of having a very clear value proposition, and that it's a privilege to work for your company if you can meet and uphold those values, which are not only business values, but character values. And then it does make it so easy for you to look at a metric during your review of like, you're not upholding this.
Yeah, it's easier to think about that way, but in reality, talent is really hard to find, especially in the technical sense or in terms of like really great talented individuals may also not be the best cultural fits. And sometimes there's really unique skill sets that you need. And so you're like, as a business owner, I'm forced to think about how much do I really need this skill set and what am I willing to sacrifice culturally in order to bring this in to accomplish what we need. And we've made that mistake and we had to learn from it, and ultimately it didn't serve us. But moving forward, like, I'll be honest, in technology, growing a company here in Los Angeles, where the engineering pool is quite small, and I'm not talking about individuals that have misconduct in making those decisions, but some engineers just aren't cultural fits, right? Maybe they're not clear communicators, maybe they're not upholding other values, and they sort of don't exhibit the behavior that we need for the company culturally, but they have such a specific skill set that we crave. Like, how do you know when to sort of pick and choose?
Well, I suppose it's not an opposition. Like, clear communication is an interesting one. Maybe somebody that's not their strength, but they're not disrespectfully communicating.
Right.
So then that might be okay.
So do you think it's possible to create blanket policies when it comes to conduct for business partners? I mean, you're talking about employees, but maybe the people you do business with, clients. Do you think that's possible? And have you considered policies like that?
I think in a space where we're dealing with such creative content that has mature, not mature, but like sometimes illicit content, right? Like, we're dealing with creative people that are telling their stories. It's really hard to draw blanket policies because you have to keep in mind the things that you say that you want to serve you as a company may not actually you may not live up to it when you determine, does that same content in a different context of maybe a creative person you're working with, does it apply then, right? Like, how do you, like, I think it's impossible to set a blanket policy where you're like, well, I don't want to do business with this executive because they're associated with this, but then an artist comes along and they're the next hot thing and they've been associated with things, but how do you determine what the sort of scale of misconduct looks like and where you're willing to draw the line? Because, you know, in our business, we value creativity and like freedom of voice, but to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, that has to be a completely personal decision, I think. You know, obviously Spotify this summer announced their conduct policy, saying it wouldn't promote or playlist artists whose personal conduct didn't meet their standards. But then there was a big backlash and they walked that back. So what did you learn from that? And maybe, Edith, you can answer that.
I think the policy itself was great. I mean, they had the best intentions. But in terms of how you pick and choose, I know that they chose certain artists, which was primarily hip hop, right? When there were a lot of other people that were not in hip hop that were also accused of misconduct in some kind of capacity, you know, personal life and music in general. So that part, to me, I was like, you know, I feel like we have to implement that into art culture musically, you know? Like, we have to figure out how we're going to carry our business itself on the inside, you know? And yes, who we decide to do business with and to what capacity we can work alongside each other. I mean, I'm trying to like phrase the right way.
Doesn't it say something in itself that we feel like we have to be really careful with the word choice here?
Yeah,
I was just thinking the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's such a tricky area, though, because, I mean, you can look at the history of music and you've got Phil Spector, Keith Moon, Sid Vicious. You know, we're not taking down the Who catalogue from Spotify. You know, there's personal conduct to the extent of people who've been convicted of murder or been convicted of crimes beyond just allegations in the press. And I think this sort of debate, it really hinges on censorship. It comes down to that. But it also comes down to the consumer has to be able to make their own choice about, you know, where they want to draw the lines of what they find acceptable. And then we as business owners maybe make the choice of who we want to be in business with and how we want to promote in the current marketplace. But the history of art and the history of music, I mean, it would be very difficult to start drawing lines about moral relativism.
I would assume that the average consumer is highly informed or accurately informed. And there's so much misinformation out there right now on people's personal conduct, you know, inside and outside of the workplace. So I think as a consumer, it's difficult to make that educated choice.
It's also, art reflects society, right? So it's not about individuals creating these emotions. There was a question was asked about, you know, is it a bad influence on, I mean, that's been the historical question about rock and roll, right? Is it a bad influence or does it actually reflect what's going on in society? And do we have to have a bigger conversation about, you know, if this art and these voices are resonating with people, what pain and what trauma is there in society that we need to address? And I think that's just such a much bigger conversation than any of us can address in our workplaces because we're, you know, I mean, it'd be great if we could solve that problem, but these are huge historical questions about, and again, like you can look back at history and go, well, they burned Beatles albums. So in 40, 50 years' time, when we look back at, you know, this culture, how will we reflect on that kind of censorship in this culture? So I found it's a very tricky conversation. I have my own values about who I want to do business with, but the Spotify thing immediately struck me as a very challenging idea, because it opens up a can of worms that, as you said, it was unfortunate that the artists they chose were really restricted to a genre. And, you know, and again, it comes back to due process and how do you evaluate it? And who sets the standards? And who gets to be judge and jury in these situations?
There was a great statement that they had said shortly afterwards that they released, basically saying something along those lines of, you know, we need to evaluate more closely and how we make this decision moving forward, you know, and hate speech, saying any kind of specifically hatred, that's still something that they're, you know, not gonna put out and they're not gonna support and they're not gonna put on playlists, but they have to just evaluate a little bit more like people's history, because I mean, some could be rumors, some are actual accusations that, you know, there's proof. So it's gonna have to be something that they're looking into much deeper moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. And to that point, some executives and artists who've been accused have denied the allegations. Some haven't addressed them publicly. So how do you decide which concerns or allegations you take into account in your own decision-making? Maybe, Ericka, you can answer that.
I mean, I think it goes back to what you said. Everyone is entitled to who they want to do business with and how they feel about a certain situation as well. So I think you just have to move accordingly for what works for you. And just making sure that you're still you at the end of the day. Like, this is still, you know, you're standing for something for yourself and for others that you're setting, you know, the tone for in your team, whether it be in a building or outside of a building, just for everyone. Like, what is it that you stand for? And I think that goes back to taking ownership of these positions that we're in. And what is that thing that you're wanting people to know about you? Like, you stand for what?
But how do you make sure someone can't point to you and say you're only turning your blind eye on this because it serves you?
There's been, in this past year, over 200 allegations over prominent figureheads. And it isn't, those are important, those are good, and those will continue to come out, but that doesn't solve the problem. You know, so-and-so losing their job doesn't solve the problem, because the problem is systemic, and it's, going back to what you were saying, like, we just quieted our voices just in this conversation. And so as somebody who came out with a story and way beyond when the actual experience happened, it's because I was scared. And so it's a culture of fear. And I love what you said, Ericka, about safety. Like, feeling that if somebody is to come forward and say, this felt uncomfortable to me, that they're gonna be heard, that they're gonna be listened to, and they're gonna be supported, because I believe there's a pervasive understanding that if I come up, there's the cost might be higher than it's worth.
I think that's definitely changed, though. I think the conversation, from my experience coming into the business in my 20s, we couldn't have had this conversation then. And I think women were definitely turning a blind eye, afraid to call out behavior that was inappropriate, you know, put their head down, just ignore it, move ahead. And I think this conversation across all industries has just really empowered women and anybody experiencing kind of a hostile environment to just be able to put their hand up, be supported in that. And I think it's not going to be a light switch, obviously, but I think these are really powerful shifts.
Absolutely.
I feel it.
Yeah, well, because conversations like this need to continue happening. And one of the pieces that seems to be missing to me is education, right? So education on the boundaries, but education also on, if you see something, say something. Sure. You know, if you overhear something, do something, because no woman who's experiencing sexual misconduct in the workplace hasn't had countless witnesses watch that happen, you know, and that there's a personal responsibility, going back with the values and the team. You keep using the word team, which I love, which is like, we look out for each other. And so if something happens to you and I see it, I do something, because maybe you don't feel comfortable enough to do it. And also educating men on that role. Like, this is your responsibility. And this is where the line is. I mentioned, like, the line is so gray. You know, it's gray in every area. It's gray in dating. Do you open the car door? Do you not open the car door? Like, men don't know what to do around women anymore.
That's a really good point. I get that question a lot. And I think the new generation especially of young male executives, I think there's a definite psychological shift. I see it, you know, with the people that work for us. And I think they're looking for guidance. They're looking for guidance. Okay, we're in the entertainment business. It's a social business. Often our lifestyles are bleeding out into the club or the concert or the after party or the event. Like, what's social, what's professional? Like, how can people interact in those environments when, you know, our business doesn't end at 5. We're not working at dental offices. You know, people don't leave at 5 and then go back to their lives. Their lives are kind of continuous and fluid through, you know, the lifestyle of music. So, you know, to your point, I think education is really a powerful tool now.
There's such an opportunity there too to completely reinvent what is it, like respect in the workplace handbooks and presentations, sort of those things that you have to go to or you're going to lose your job, but reinventing that and giving concrete examples. Like, is it okay if I say like, oh my gosh, I love your new haircut, Edith, and I'm a man? Or now have I now just crossed the line? You know, to understand where the lines are. And from a mental health perspective, to understand what it does to somebody, how it corrodes somebody's spirit when they are sexually harassed, like what that actually does. Because I think if you haven't experienced it, you have no idea. And you might think of it as, oh, it's so harmless. Or actually, aren't you flattered when I tell you that you have a nice ass? You know, so to educate men on what it actually does in the short term and the long term, I think is missing.
I'm sorry. I think the conversation is more open though, because men in the music business, which I work alongside so many wonderful men, they have asked me, have I ever made you uncomfortable? You know, and so that conversation wouldn't have happened.
Exactly, yeah. I'm experiencing the same thing. Just a lot of good intention. And honestly, some men who really didn't realize what was going on. They were really not aware that this was as pervasive as it is.
Desensitized.
Yeah, and I think the conversation's powerful, the awareness is powerful. I think the awareness in itself is a deterrent because people become more conscious.
One thing that, just to go back to what you were saying about education, that I personally struggled with as a small business owner that's starting to grow is, so if I want to bring in an expert to come train my team on workplace respect, on, you know, not even like the full HR, because we don't need a full HR function. We're not big enough for 35 people. We have a dedicated person who deals with people operations, but we can't afford like a fully trained professional, right? But we need to bring in people to not only train the staff, but train managers. How do I find that person? There's like no resource or publication that's printed a list of certified HR trainers or consultants who deal with misconduct or deal with these issues that we can bring in, even for like a seminar, at a price point that we can afford. Of course, there's people that do it for like the major labels and do it for bigger corporations, but for smaller businesses, whether it's management companies or even like startups like us, like I wish I had a resource I could rely on to even find who those professionals are.
And it's so important too, because I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a small business, you're grooming the next generation of leaders. And
you're
that's
setting
such a huge opportunity.
And you're setting the core expectations with your team as you scale. You gotta instill that with the first 30 people that work at your company, because before you know it, if you keep growing at a pace that most technology companies grow, you get so big into such a big scale where it's so easy to dilute those values. And we saw that happening even from when we went from 10 people to 30 people. And then from 30 to 50, like huge gap.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. When I was going through my Me Too story, Time's Up was very supportive legally and from a PR standpoint. And when I kind of got over the hardest part of it, I reached out to them and I said, where are the mental health services for all of these women? I happen to be in a very fortunate position as now a mental health professional, but most people aren't that. And how are they healing and being able to move on with their lives? And they told me that it was impossible to create that as a resource. And I also talked to them about education and how do we go in? How do we help? How do we actually create shift? Because again, having someone lose their job, okay, that's like one small piece of it. It doesn't change, you know, anything. This is a cultural issue. And I kept getting backlash from Time's Up saying that's too much. That's too much for them to handle. There's too much liability around that. But you raised such a good point. That seems like a solvable problem.
And it does bring up the issue that there's a range of experience with it, which is what we have to acknowledge is certain things land with certain people differently, and that's where the confusion is. And I think we're trying to create safe workspaces. We have a small company as well, so it's a little bit easier because you have some intimate knowledge of the people that work for you, and you're sort of hiring from a place of consciousness and a place of generally referral and people coming into the workplace that are known to you or, you know, known to people that work there. But as you get into these scaled companies and all of a sudden you're encountering people that you don't have intimate connections with, you don't have an intimate friendship or a, you know, a sense of personal trust with, I think, you know, there's just such a wide range of experiences of how this is being, you know, handled. And I think the resources are really, because I think there's a ton of resources now around diversity and inclusion. There's a ton of resources, but this sort of workplace conduct is really every company's handling it in their own way, and there's probably room for some standardization of that.
And I think the topic also should include a perspective that's not just about like sexual harassment, right? To the point you made earlier about some of your staff coming to you, like the men being like, am I behaving? Like, have I ever done anything? The men want a framework to follow. They want tools at their hands so that they can also help us along the way. And I don't even know where to find an expert, because I'm definitely not that person, to bring in to help cultivate that and to help grow that and instill it so that it can scale. And I just wish that existed because that's one thing that I think could be super helpful. Like, I don't think we can come up with a framework for policy making at large scale, but I love even having the conversation about, well, what tools are missing, right? And what can we tackle that? Because that is to your point about like figuring out the root of or some root of the problem, because I'm sure there's many in different directions.
The lines are so blurry when it comes like to the music business. Like, think about the lyrical content. We brushed up a little bit on that.
Question, yeah.
I mean, they talk about some crazy things in these songs. So, you know, you're evaluating a song, you're talking to somebody specifically about these lyrics, which are explicit, you know, and men have to know how to handle, well, we're giving constructive criticism on this, but the lines are so blurry because this is what the lyrical content is. And then we have to speak very openly to you about, you know, your personal life, because this is what goes into the songs, you know? So there's a very personal relationship in music. As a manager, I have a very personal relationship with my clients, you know? I know all about their lives. We're so like intertwined, you know, and it's the same thing as an A&R. You go into the studio with them and they're writing their hearts out about, you know.
1000%. And even when it comes for the basement, as far as picking talent that performs on that platform, making sure that, you know, my main thing is, what is the end result? Like, I want to help you tell your story. That's what this was based off on, to highlight artists and then give them a platform to be in a room with some of the top executives, you know, that could help them. And so it's making sure that they also have something that they're standing for and a message that they're trying to give out, and like how we can help just expand that for them. So I agree with you. No, it definitely is touchy, but I think, again, that goes back to standing for what you stand for and making sure that you're representing it well.
So Ericka, do you think artists can be held to the same standard as executives? In this way, I mean, obviously there's a lot of conversations about the kind of figureheads of companies. There's been some accusations against artists. You know, do artists get held to the same standards in these issues?
I don't think it necessarily has to be the stamp of is an artist or is an executive. Is it a person? Just like you should be held to accountable for whatever you are, whatever industry. If you were a dentist, a doctor, or, you know, an executive. I think it's just that thing. Instead of just keying on which one it is, it's a person in general.
See, that's just how I live.
Yeah, like if you do something wrong, you should be held accountable for that,
yeah.
You know, regardless of where you work. And so I think it's just, again, going back to, are you still working with that person? Like, how does that happen? I think it's a case by case, because everyone's story is different. You know, a person that could be, unfortunately, horrible to someone else could be someone that you're actually really cool with and you've never seen this side of them. I think that's where you have to have that conversation with yourself on, you know, where does this friendship go? Where does this work relationship go?
And there's an opportunity to support people when they, this is hard to choose the words again, but say like a low level offense, you know, to infiltrate at that moment and help that person and help educate them and give them other tools to communicate what they might be wanting to communicate, or if they're sort of overusing their power, to understand like why, what's missing, why are you doing that, so that we can sort of have a, like visually what comes up to me is like green light, yellow light, red light. You know, so if I'm in conversation with somebody and I'm starting to feel uncomfortable and I'm like, oh, we are crossing the line, maybe I can just say, oh, yellow light, bro. Like, this isn't feeling, so that they have an awareness.
Yeah, but
so it doesn't get to red light.
I agree with you, but I also feel like we're in the music industry, and one thing that we can't take away is like the creativity and the vibe of things. So I think in telling, you know, setting these rules and making awareness and teaching people about things, you also have to figure out how to keep the environment going. You know, I can't imagine being in a studio and it's just stale because no one feels like they're comfortable enough to be themselves. Like, how do we move forward in that? Like, that's what I want to be a part of. And, you know, even with picking talent for the basement, how do am I part of the change to make it better? That just the energy just still like, you signed up for the music industry to make great music.
Have you had any conversations with artists about the Me Too movement?
You know, I work with artists. I have an artist by the name of Lauren Sanderson, who is a huge advocate of the Me Too movement. And Lauren is just a boss chick. And there's certain things that if she doesn't want to work with a person or do something, she's no problem telling you that. So I think it's just, you know, again, making sure that all artists feel comfortable enough with expressing what they won't do and what they will do.
Yeah.
So what type of rules do you think companies can put in place to regulate personal relationships in the workplace? Do companies allow employees to date each other, for example? And what's the protocol where you work now? Ericka, maybe you can weigh in?
As far as for the basement, I have a policy of, like, again, I want us all to feel like family, but I think it's just, you should never let anything affect your work as far as like your personal relationship with someone. And at the point that it gets to that, you know, I would hope that my team, we can sit down and discuss and you let me know what's going on, just so you can be aware of it and also give pointers on that. I've never dated someone in my workspace, so I can't speak on that. But I don't want to be a person to say that you can't do that. Like, I don't think you can, you know.
I got married to someone I worked with. And he moved into the company when we had already started dating, but our relationship really took off in that space and sort of like us working together for about a year before I left to start STEM. And so I can't say like, you can't date your colleagues in my company because I got married to my husband and we worked together. I think it has to be consensual, right? And if one person's uncomfortable in the pursuit, like hopefully they come and speak up about it and they know who to go to and express that. But I think it's inevitable. I mean, we work so much in entertainment, right? It's not a 9-to-5 job. And so I think it's really hard to have relationships with people that maybe don't work in your industry or you're not working with at all.
You have to understand your lifestyle.
Yeah.
It's a 24-hour job.
And so much of this conversation is about power as well. It's about abuse of power, you know, as you said, consensual interactions and whether someone has choices or perceives that they have choices or feels threatened or their job feels threatened. And I think, you know, we're in such a small company, it doesn't come up for us. And I think it's, you know, we have the similar family environment but I've been in big companies and medium-sized companies. And I think, you know, I've never had sort of limitations around that, but I can understand that as a business leader and a business owner, you just have to be conscious of power dynamics in your company and how those are being used, how those are being kind of, the lines are being blurred. And I think, you know, so much of the movement is about power. It's about where power was misused and where people felt like they couldn't say no or they couldn't, you know, put their hand up and say something at the time. So maybe you can speak to that, Tristan.
I agree. I mean, it is completely a misappropriation of power. And I keep coming back to your concept of values because I think that's it's refreshing. And I hope that more companies align themselves and really it seems like your company has given a lot of thought to what you stand for and you're willing to revise it as you go and as you scale. And it's always going to come back to that. So if we value each other as a family, as a team, then how would I show up? You know, I would only show up as my highest self with the utmost respect for my colleagues. And this might sound simple, but it sort of obliterates any potential for complication because you're only hiring people who come from that ethos. You know, and hopefully creating the next generation. You know, we talk so much in this industry about the boys club. You know, and I've heard so many people say if just the boys club would die off. You know, it's like, well, has the boys club raised another boys club?
There's probably raising
another boys club. What's that?
There's probably a women's club that's just as bad as the boys club too.
Well, for sure. And I think that's an interesting point. And I think it's the job collectively. Like, how would we know when this problem is resolved? You know, what I've always said is this problem is resolved is when, you know, my son and your daughter go into this industry, you know, 20 years from now, and the whole concept of sexual misconduct, they're like, wait, what is that? Like, I don't even know what that is. The same way that we look at smoking on airplanes as like, wait, people used to do that? That's insane.
I mean, I feel like that's already happening. I see that, I would say, the generation of our kind of mid-20s, and I just feel like it's just not an issue. I think there's a different kind of empowerment with the women. I feel there's a different kind of consciousness with the men. And I think there's a different kind of open conversation about it happening now, you know, because of these accusations, that people don't feel like they have to hide in the corner.
That's what's so great about that. That's why this uprising is so important, and that we continue to have these kind of conversations. You know, when we see shirts that, you know, say the future is female, I worry about that. There's something beautiful and wonderful and empowering about that, but where does that leave boys? Because we don't want, you know, the new women's club to diminish the importance of men. Because it's only going to then make them seek more power. It's going to be so confusing.
Men, there's a great organization called Her Music Club, which we've gone to the events, and a lot of men are showing up and they're supporting. That's great. You know, and so when you look around the room, it's not just a bunch of chicks. You know, it's men, girl power. You know, and they're talking about very interesting topics similar to what we're talking about too. And they want to, like, women want to help each other. You know, when we're saying Her Music Club, Girls Club, like, I feel like before there might have been a little bit of a competition with women because there were so little women in the workspace. And now it's like, hey, let me help you up. You know, I love having interns and assistants. I love, like, teaching them, mentoring them, helping them, you know, and I'm thankful for my mentors in the past. And women now are reaching out to each other, you know, with great organizations like Her Music Club. What's the other one? Girls Make Beats, right? They're teaching songwriters, producers, engineers, you know, all young girls that, you know, want to be in the music business. So those things are coming to light. They're getting a lot more publicity. You know, shout out to them. It's great. But that wasn't possible, you know, that it was very much a boys' club. You know, when I started out in the music business, it was a lot more difficult to get any recognition for, you know, the credits that you have done, you know, whether you brought in songwriters or producers or artists, like, you know, it was all boys, you know, you bring someone in, they would take the reins afterwards, you know, so now we're getting more opportunities, which is great.
I experienced that with Reboot, which was after the first one. We mostly invited women because we had such a small space. We only had a room for about 50 people. And after the first two, the biggest feedback I got was men reaching out saying, well, how can I help? What can I do? Can I come? So we expanded the space because we were just looking at it from the point of view of, well, it's about allies. It's about recruiting, support. And I think there is so much support for this conversation. And for me, it's really exciting to see for the young generation of female executives that we're nurturing, is that they probably won't have to encounter it in the same way that we did, or dodge it in the same way that we did, or swerve around it in the same way that we did. And I think you know, it's this great conversation to have. So finally, do you guys think the Me Too movement is just getting started, or do you think this is simmering down now?
I think that I won't say it's simmering down, but I think it's more so starting another movement of everyone just being able to work together and feeling comfortable and communicating. And going back to what you said, I've met more incredible women than I've, you know, met in the past 2 years, and just I'm aware of just all these other things that we're out here doing. And I think if anything, like, we are now a part of the change, and we're a part of, like, this new wave and this new thing, you know, that I think could turn into something beautiful for everyone.
It's so inspiring to think, you know, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and this experience is going to be in history books. And I think what has simmered down is sort of the shock and anger, you know, from, like, the last year, every time a story would come out in any industry. And now I think we're able to put on, you know, our, like, sort of the cerebral side of it, and really create new policy and shift in consciousness. And that's the most exciting part to me, you know, because that's where we'll look back and go, I can't believe that ever was a thing, and how amazing that we were able to work together, not just women, but women and men, to solve it.
Yeah, and I think you have to look to the reception to it. It wouldn't have become a movement if there wasn't support for it, and I think...
And you're going to end up with more creativity.
Now that we're able to solve these problems, we're going to create cultures where people feel so safe. And with safety, I think, comes freedom. And with freedom comes infinite creativity. So I think you're going to get better artists being able to produce more heartfelt music and have people around them, not in fear, but in enthusiasm.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was a great conversation, hopefully the beginning of many more. And thanks for your time today.
Thank you.